Good morning. Welcome to the Dev Policy Centre's 2024 Aid Budget Breakfast. I'm Amita Monterola. I'm the editor of the Dev Policy blog and co-host of the newly relaunched Dev Policy podcast, Dev Policy Talks podcast. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land from which we're coming and bringing you this event today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. From here in Canberra at the Australian National University, we welcome Indigenous leaders, past, present and emerging, and we'd like to extend this acknowledgement to First Nations people who may be joining us from around the region and around the world. This is DevPol's 13th annual budget breakfast. This event has evolved into an opportunity not only to go through the numbers, but also to take a look at the wider state of Australian aid effectiveness and development policy. Now, I'd like to introduce the speakers for today. Our first speaker this morning, Professor Stephen Howes, is Dev Policy Centre's Director. Stephen will look at aid in the context of the budget and also take a look at recent aid effectiveness issues. In January 2016, DevPol launched the Australian Aid Tracker, which has since become the go-to site for anyone interested in up-to-date trends and comparisons regarding Australian aid. This morning, our second speaker is our research officer, Sharon Liu, who not only keeps the aid tracker up to date, including last night, but has expanded and improved it. So she'll be sharing some of those enhancements with you. Finally, we are this year again extending our analysis to the global picture with senior researcher, Dr. Cameron Hill. Cam's analysis will update us on how Australia ranks in terms of aid generosity, as well as looking at some of the looming pressures on multilateral aid. Then there'll be some time for questions, so I hope you have a full cup of coffee ready. I'm going to put up the events for the Development Policy Centre now while we go through a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to remind you that you can use the chat function to send us questions this morning. We'll take as many as we can, but if we don't get to your question now, Stephen and Cameron will also cover some extra topics during the budget podcast that we record this week. The episode will be published on our Dev Policy Talks podcast, which is back after a 2-year break. And if your colleagues missed this event, we'll post the presentation slides, and we have already published a Dev Policy blog this morning. Plus, we're going to have a video of this event posted to Dev Policy YouTube later today. I'll invite Stephen to address you.
All right, and thank you, Amita, and thank you to my colleagues for making this team effort. I'm going to kick off, as Amita said, with some analysis of the numbers and of aid performance. So let's start with the broader context of aid and the budget. I thought this graph is very revealing. Actually, it's not from budget night, it's from just before the budget it was put out. It shows the terms of trade, which is how much we get for our exports relative to how much we have to pay for our imports. And as you can see, we're actually in the middle of a second huge terms of trade boom, which actually dwarfs the one of the early 2000s. And I think that's interesting because, of course, it was in the early 2000s that the scale up or build up of Australian aid began. And, you know, the terms of trade boom wasn't the only driver of that. There was 9/11. There were the Millennium Development Goals, but it was one significant factor. And you know, you might think that with another terms of trade boom, we'd be in for another period of scaling up of the aid program. But of course, if you did think that, then you wouldn't be paying much attention. You'd be living on a different planet. In fact, it's a very different boom. You know, everyone's feeling cost of living pressures. I think there's also a sense, it's much more of a sense that it's going to be temporary. I think with the first boom, we thought this was going to go on forever and ever. This one is more temporary. But also there are some very big budget pressures. And this is a graph from last night's budget that I think really tells that story. This highlights those areas which the government's identified as the fastest growing. So it's aged care, medical benefits, hospitals, defence, NDIS, and interest. And they're all growing at 6% plus for the next decade. So well above the rate of inflation. And if you compare that to the first boom, I think the only one of these that was really a pressure was medical. I guess healthcare has always been a area of spending pressure, but aged care was a much lower priority. Defence, a much lower priority. NDIS didn't exist. And of course, we'd paid down the debt, rather than coming out of COVID as we have this time. So with those spending pressures, that's just squeezing out everything else, and it's certainly squeezing out foreign aid. And so, for the same period as we'll see, the ODA increase is only 2.5%. That is in line with inflation over the next decade. Just to give one example, this is the ODA defence. When we started doing this analysis, the ratio of defence spending to ODA was between 6 and 8, the ratio, and it was actually that sort of right from the 60s for 50 years. But now it's gone up above 10, and it's going to go to above 16. So that's the broader context. And now turning to aid itself, this is the Australian aid numbers as revealed last night in the budget. And what we see is actually a very small increase. It's about 3 or 4% relative to what was foreshadowed in the first year of the forward estimates last year. So once we adjust for inflation, as these figures do, we do see a slight tick up in aid this year. And then after that, as I said, it's basically kept in line with inflation, which is around 2.5%. And so aid is for the foreseeable future. Remember in the last budget, Labor added this extra decade, which hadn't been there before. So we're basically saying for the foreseeable future, aid is going to be at $5 billion. So when you look at this and then you think about the Labor rhetoric, which is about rebuilding the aid program, it's very hard to see this as a rebuild. You could see this as flatlining. You don't see it as a rebuild. I think for a rebuild, you've got to see an upward trajectory. Of course, there is a very modest upward trajectory. And I guess if we keep seeing those upward trajectories, if we keep seeing the modest increases, perhaps we could say it's a very gradual rebuild. But at the moment, I think it's much more a flatlining or a stabilization rather than a rebuild. And of course, the key indicator when we do international comparisons, and Cameron will talk more about this, is the ODA to GNI ratio. And that hardly budges. Yeah, it's slightly better because of that 3% sort of increase this year and over the forward estimates, 3 to 4%. But it really doesn't make any difference when we look at the ODA to GNI ratio. Right now, it's about 0.19. It's going to fall down to below 0.15. So those on the aid aggregates. When we turn to where's the money being spent, I think the big message is further concentration of aid on the Pacific. That's the blue line at the bottom. It's a sort of inexorable rise. It's now at 42%, slightly up from last year. But if you go back another decade, right, it was just above 20%. So that really is a huge transformation of the Australian aid program. And if you combine the overall flatlining with the increased share going to the Pacific, that explains why the ABC's Pacific Beat is now the only media outlet that actually covers the foreign aid program. The next, another cut you can do is sectoral. I think this is an interesting one. We see a big priority on governance. The government foreshadowed that through its new aid policy, which put governance front and center. But we also see a increase in the next two columns, which are economic infrastructure. In the next column, which is economic infrastructure and services, and that's infrastructure. That's what you might normally associate with a Liberal government, but with this government, definitely with the competition with China, we've got a big focus on infrastructure, and so you see that taking up 16% the aid program. Other areas are pretty constant: agriculture, trade and production, education. Then humanitarian is flat as well, and so something has to give, and that's health. So health is actually down to 13%. It's the 1 second from the top. And actually, although we can't do the sectoral analysis for all the sectors for a longer period, we can for health, because other sectors were sort of reclassified, but health has been left unchanged for the last decade. And so you can see the huge reduction in health spending coming out of, or the huge increase going into the pandemic, and then the huge reduction coming out of the pandemic. And then the further reduction this year. Quite surprising, for a Labor government, and given that we've just been through a pandemic. But I guess with the limited aid spending and with that focus on governance and infrastructure, something's got to give. And somehow it does seem to be health that is kind of the swing sector that emerges, that can go up or down depending on the sort of emphasis of the day. The final cut is on delivery partners. This is one where we can only look at the historical data. You don't get budget data on that, so it's a little bit out of date. Not a lot of surprises there, but I'll discuss this further when we come to localization. And then finally, on major budget initiatives, as I mentioned, the Pacific overall is a winner, and that translates into big gains for Tuvalu in particular, where there's funding set aside to help implement the Australia-Tuvalu Treaty, and also to grant Tuvalu a new submarine cable. 87 million for a tiny country, I think just above 10,000 is a huge amount of money. And, I don't think it's going to stay at that level, but it is interesting to compare that to the entire ODA allocation for Sub-Saharan Africa, which is at 102 million. Not a lot of difference. Fiji is another winner. Sorry, there's a mistake there. I think that's meant to be 123, not 1237. But it's about a 40 million increase for Fiji for two reasons, as we understand it. One is continued budget support for Fiji as it copes with the fiscal stress post-COVID, but also just earlier this month, there was an agreement that Australia will grant fund a port expansion in Fiji, and so extra money is required for that. Indonesia, also an increase, about 30 million for the recently announced flagship climate and energy initiative. There are also two new sort of multilateral commitments for which additional funding is needed. The Green Climate Fund and the Pacific Resilience Facility. So 65 million is set aside for those two this year. Another initiative is that for the first time this year, we have the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific. Some of that can be counted as ODA, and that has been counted over the last couple of years when it comes to actually presenting the actuals. But now, consistent with that, they're saying, okay, well, we can actually make a budget estimate for that. So we see some amount in the budget as the budget estimate for the grant equivalent of AIFFP. And that's really it in terms of the budget. So, if people have specific queries, we'll try and answer them when we go to Q&A. But I'm actually going to move on now to look at aid performance. So I think starting a couple of years ago, we have used these budget breakfasts to also put the spotlight on aid effectiveness. Of course, aid effectiveness or aid quality is as important as aid quantity. And given that aid quantity just isn't changing that much, that does open up more room for discussion on aid effectiveness. So I want to tackle two topics here. One is on aid performance, returning to that, and then the other one's on localization. In terms of aid performance, as you might know if you've been to some of the earlier breakfasts, before 2020, the aid program looked at all the investments and how many were rated satisfactory. This is not quite the official figures, but it's close to it. And you can see it was a very positive story, very positive trend. It got up to 90% of investments rated satisfactory. But the aid program then made a change itself in 2020, which I think was a good, very good change, which is that rather than focus on only ongoing investments, it would only focus on completed investments. And that actually told a very different story, a much more critical story, and a somewhat negative story. It's actually bounced back a bit this year, this is based on the most recent performance report that's just actually been released. But yeah, quite a different story to the one based on ongoing investments. And what the government said now in its new performance framework that was released with the new development policy, it's a sort of hedging your bets policy. So it's going to look at both the ongoing investments and the completed investments. I think the problem with that is that it's, as you can see from this slide, and as is made explicit on this one, there's a big disconnect. And the ongoing investments get a much higher satisfactory rate than the completed ones. With the 22-23 data that's just been released, you can see that disconnect's gone down. That's a very, that's promising. But in fact, when we analyze the reason for that, it's mainly just good luck that in that year, it was on average some pretty good investments that were closed. And so they're going to be more likely to be satisfactory. If we look at the pure disconnect, or what we call the ratings effect, we don't see much change. It's still around 20 percentage points, which is very significant. Now, according to DFAT itself, if you read the performance report, this is not a bug, but a design feature, as these projects are held to a higher standard when they're closed. But that doesn't make much sense to us. We have a different explanation. You can see the disconnect isn't a permanent feature. It's really something that emerged in 2019. And it was in 2019 that these completed projects were handed over to consultants. Earlier, like the ongoing investments, they'd been done by the managers. And obviously, if the managers are rating the investment, they're going to have a strong bias. That's only natural. And with handing it off to more independent consultants, you're going to get a more objective assessment. And so to us, that's the explanation for this disconnect, not a higher standard. But also, if there is a higher standard, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, because suddenly you're going to find out, well, actually the project didn't succeed, and it's too late by then because the project or investment's already closed. And you can see that this is the list from that's another typo, late night typo. That should be 22-23 from the performance report. These are the unsatisfactory investments. There are 13 of them. But you can see the bold ones are ones that were regarded as satisfactory in their last ongoing investment, but which have now been downgraded to unsatisfactory on completion. And there are actually 8 of them. And there were 2 that we couldn't find the ongoing investment. There are only 3 then that were actually rated unsatisfactory before they were closed. And it obviously doesn't make sense to get this big surprise once the investment's finished that, okay, actually it didn't work. In particular, a positive thing is that DFAT is now giving the reason for why these investments are unsatisfactory. But the dominant reason is this monitoring and evaluation. And, that is something that can be noticed before the investment is closed and can be fixed. So I think this disconnect is still an issue. And until that it's sort of resolved or addressed, we're going to focus on those completed investments. All right, that's a topic we've talked about before, and a topic we want to cover increasingly as we go forward is localization, because that's a big priority, and rightly so, for the new development policy. And the 22-23 performance report has a big section on localization. But I just want to give a few comments on that. They've got some good indicators, but there's one big indicator that's missing, and that's sort of budget support or funds to partner governments. It just isn't mentioned. I'm not saying there should necessarily be a target for this, but it certainly should be a focus when we're looking at localization. And it's actually a very positive story. This actually comes from that earlier graph, just focusing on funds to partner governments. So not only budget support, could also be investment loans. You can see it really fell away as we moved away from loans to Indonesia, down to 3%. And it's really built up again, the highest ever, actually, 22-23 for the period of data that we've got. So that is actually our dominant form of localization and needs to feature a lot more in discussions and analysis. Then the one indicator that they do have that they lead off on that I'm critical of is this one of hiring local staff. And so we're told that managing contractors hired 3,842 local staff and subcontractors in 22-23, and that this was an increase of 15%. And so this is sort of a positive indicator for localization. Now, you know, I'm a big fan of hiring national staff, and I've done so myself in my earlier career in the World Bank, but I don't see it as a form of locally led development. And in fact, in fragile states, in small states, it can be a form of delocalization. And, you know, there's analysis on this, that especially when donors are large, skilled labor is short, this sort of practice can actually subvert administrative capacity. The report gives not only the number of staff, but the total salary bill for those staff. And you can work out then the average salary is 37,740. I mean, that's pretty low by Australian standards, but it is, for example, 9 times the PNG minimum wage. And one question I have for the AID program is, do we have a salary policy, a sort of national salary policy? Are we making sure that we're not sucking out the best staff from partner governments, from partner NGOs, and from partner private sector companies? I think this is an issue that needs a lot more attention. It certainly needs to be broken down between Asia and the Pacific, and shouldn't be an indicator for localization. Another indicator, and I'll end here, that is given that I think is much more useful is the funding passed on to local organizations. And you can see from that 20% of managing contractor funds are passed on to local organization. There's virtually no Australian NGO development funding where the cash is actually handed over, but 36% of the humanitarian partnership, of the Australian Humanitarian Partnership, cash is handed over. So if you add all this together, you get to about 290 million. We certainly expect that to grow over time as we move down the localization road. But that 290 million is only 2/3 of the budget support that we provided in 22-23, and that just reemphasizes the need to put focus really on budget support if we are serious about localization. So I'll end here, and back to you, Amita.
Now, as many of you know, the Dev Policy team has built a massive resource called the Australian Aid Tracker. And at this point, we need to acknowledge the work that Ashley Bettridge and Terence Wood, who are both online, have put into this website over many years. We're very pleased today to have our latest research officer, Sharon Liu, back from maternity leave to tell you all about the latest updates to the tracker.
Hi everyone, happy to talk about Australian Aid Tracker. It is a very useful website for you to find information related to important questions such as how has Australian aid changed over time? How does Australia compare to other donors in terms of aid giving? Where does Australian aid go, and who does Australian aid support? Many of the graphs covered in this presentation, including those in Stephen as well as Cameron's part, can also be found on Australian Aid Tracker, and you can find a lot more useful information by using the link here. In the next few minutes, I will talk about 3 graphs from the Australian Aid Tracker that I really want to highlight. The first one is about the long-term trend of Australia's aid generosity, and we do follow the International Convention of using aid to GNI to measure the aid generosity. This graph goes back to 1961-62, and you can see that the highest value Australia has reached was 0.48, and that was achieved about half a century ago. Still, that level is now close to the international agreed target of 0.7%. And ever since then, Australia's aid generosity has been declining. There was a temporary scale up in the last Labour government in the early 2010s, but that was very temporary. And now, as Stephen said, Australia's aid generosity in terms of ODA to GNI is just going further and further away from the international targets. So it is not surprising to see that Australia's ranking among its peers has been declining as well. So this chart shows Australia's ranking among the 31 OECD Development Assistance Committee countries in terms of ODA to GNI, aid per capita, aid volume, and size of the economy. Overall, Australia's economy has performed really well. Australia has remained a status of the 9th or 10th largest economy for a long period. But in contrast, Australia's ranking on ODA to GNI, aid per capita, and aid volume are all declining over the past decades. And in 2023, Australia ranks 26 out of 31 DAC countries. One of the reasons for this poor result is many other DAC countries, they include in-donor refugee costs as part of the as aid, while Australia doesn't. So we did this little exercise of removing the in-donor refugee cost from the aid and compare the countries again. And this time, Australia's ranking does improve, but only slightly from 26th to 24th. You can find more information with details on Australia's rankings on the tracker. And this year, we introduced some more graphs that cover some exciting topics. And this is one example. You probably cannot see the title here. It says focusing on gender and climate. So this chart, it used OECD data and shows Australia's aid spending on gender and climate change as a proportion of the total bilateral Australian aid commitment. So each aid project is assigned a score, one of the 4 scores, depending on its relevance to the gender or climate change. For example, for gender projects, the projects can either be principally focused on gender, have a significant or secondary objective on gender, not focusing on gender, or not screened against this objective. And in 2022, we can see that half of the Australian commitments, bilateral commitments, have a principal or significant gender focus. And for climate change, OECD does evaluate the projects against more specific objectives such as climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. We can see that over time, the share of Australian bilateral aid commitments targeting climate change has been increasing. In the 2023 development policy, the Australian government has committed to increase its spending on gender and climate change. It even says that all the new investments over $3 million will have gender targets, and half of those will have climate change targets. So we do expect these colored proportion of the columns to jump up, and we will continue to track if Australian aid delivers on these promises. Now I will hand over to my colleague Cameron to talk more about global and multilateral aid.
Thank you, Sharon. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all, and thanks for joining today. Yeah, I'm going to speak a little bit about global and multilateral aid, some of it we've covered through the previous speakers. As Sharon mentioned, and the OECD did put out its data on global aid last month. And so in 2023, Australia ranked 26th out of the 31 members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. And as Sharon also mentioned, there are more donors counting more of a share of their refugee costs in country as aid. So we did make that adjustment. And as Sharon mentioned, when you do that, Australia moves up, but only slightly, from 26th to 24th. And I think, when you make that adjustment, the 2 countries that we overtake on ODA GNI are Estonia and Czechia. So not a huge difference there. But I want to spend a bit more time this morning focusing on a part of the aid budget that doesn't get too much attention in the Australian aid community, which is multilateral aid. And I want to do that for two reasons. First of all, as Stephen mentioned, as the share of aid to the Pacific in particular has gone up, and also to a lesser extent Southeast Asia, it's created less room for other parts of the aid budget. And you don't see too many Australian political parties going to an election saying they're going to increase multilateral aid. So it is a part of the aid budget that is under pressure. Australia's multilateral aid, share of aid going towards multilateral funding is decreasing. And at the same time, there's more and more multilateral funds, I guess, that are making calls on Australia's aid budget. And this chart, this graphic here from the Centre for Global Development shows that over the next couple of years, we do have a lot of big replenishments coming up, including we've just had one for the Asian Development Fund, for the World Bank's IDA, and many others. And you know, those big multilateral replenishments do coincide with political cycles in some of the big donor countries, including Australia's political cycle, but also importantly the US. And the US is the biggest funder to some of these global funds. And obviously a Trump victory in November would have some pretty big implications, I would argue, for some of these. Next slide, please, Amita. So Australia doesn't spend, in comparative terms, Australia doesn't spend a large amount of its aid budget on core multilateral funding. We do provide a large share of aid through multilateral organisations, but we don't provide a lot of our aid to multilateral organisations in the form of core funding. So you can see there that in 2022, which is the last year available, Australia only spent about 15% of its aid budget on core funding, only ahead of Japan and the US. Next slide, thanks, Amita. It does bounce around a bit though, importantly, and that's because the repayment, the payment schedules for these multilateral contributions, you know, do bounce around a fair bit. So, you know, while in 2022 it was about 15%, it has been higher in previous years, but as you can see, there is kind of a downward trajectory that you can see from over the last kind of 6-7 years or so. So yeah, again, just reinforces the point that in comparative terms, Australia is not a big multilateral core funder compared to some of our donor peers. Next slide, please. Thanks, Amita. So I'll just go quickly through some of the big multilateral funds that Australia contributes to and look at how we've been going on these replenishments. So for the Asian Development Fund, we've just had that replenishment, and Australia has maintained its position in the ADF. So at the last ADF replenishment about a week ago, Australia committed $492 million, which was an increase on our previous replenishment. And according to what we know, maintains Australia's position at second overall, just behind Japan, in terms of its contributions to the ADF. So that's an example where we've kind of seemed to have been able to maintain our share of contribution. Next slide, please. It's a different story for the World Bank's International Development Association, and this is the concessional part of the World Bank that provides concessional loans and grants to low-income members. And you can see here that, you know, we really have slid down the contributor scale over the last 20 years or so. So we did get up to a peak of around 11 in terms of IDA contributors from the 15 to 17 IDA period. But at the last IDA in 2023, yeah, we've slipped right down to 18th now. And yeah, as I mentioned previously, the next IDA replenishment will be at the end of this year. So it'll be interesting to see where Australia goes on that ranking for IDA. Next slide, please. I'll just turn now to two of the big health funds. So the Global Fund is an important part of Australia's global health contribution. And according to our data, we've been able to increase our share or our position on funding to the Global Fund. So, we started out at 15th over 20 years ago, and as at 2023-25, we have moved up to 10th. So again, this will be one to watch. I think the next Global Fund replenishment will commence towards the end of next year, 2025. So this will be another one to watch. And finally, next slide, please, Amita. I'll just turn to Gavi, which is another important fund for Australia's health contributions, global health contributions. And yeah, the story is, I guess, fairly mixed here. We have moved up. We did kind of peak at 6. We've moved down a bit to 9th in terms of our direct contributions to Gavi. So another one to watch. I think Gavi will begin its kind of next replenishment process towards the end of this year and running into next year. So that'll be one to watch over the need period as well. Final slide. Thanks, Amita. Yeah, and it's important to note also, obviously, that these aren't the only multilateral funds that we contribute to. They're just some of the big ones. There's others. And again, this, I think, highlights, some of the emerging pressures that are going to be on this part of the aid budget over the next couple of years. Particularly if, we see a Trump administration in the US, there'll be really big pressures on these funds, these big global funds. So the WHO wants to move to a replenishment kind of model. The GPE, Australia's a donor to that. And there's a couple that we haven't made a call on yet. So the UN Fund for Loss and Damage. And, there has been some talk recently about whether we would rejoin DFAT. And just finally, there's also in the works this new discussion internationally in the context of the upcoming COP meeting towards the end of the year on a new collective quantified goal for climate finance. So that, the global target for climate finance. Now, that won't just be delivered through multilateral funding, but multilateral funding will be one of the vehicles through which, states will attempt to achieve that new goal when it's finalised. So yeah, a bit of a picture of, some of the emerging pressures on multilateral aid. Thanks, Amita. Cheers.
We'll open the floor to everybody to add their questions to the chat. As I said, if we don't get time today to go through all of the questions, we have got Stephen and Cam on an episode of Dev Policy Talks podcast this week. So please keep adding them, and we'll do our best in the next little bit less than 20 minutes to answer them. We might start off with a question from Nick Austin perhaps for Stephen to start off with. Australia's international development policy states that Australia will concentrate our resources on the issues that matter most to our neighbours. Does the budget this year reflect this? And how are we going to know?
Okay, well, that's a tough question. Let me, I might just share the screen again. Go back to the slides, if that's all right. Yeah, so yeah, the question is, how do we, are we concentrating on the issues that matter to our neighbours? I think the first thing, what we can say is that we're definitely concentrating on our neighbours, right? Like I mentioned before that increase in aid, in the share or the focus of the aid program on the Pacific, or we've actually shown Pacific and Timor-Leste, which, is just amazing. Over the last decade, it's gone from 20% to 40%, so basically a doubling. Then you add to that, because we think about our neighbours, right? Well, they're obviously our neighbours. And then you think about that Southeast and East Asia, that would be our sort of next closest set of neighbours. And that's pretty much stayed the same, right? At around 20%. That was actually squeezed when aid was cut in order to make room for the Pacific. But the government, well, just over time, but also with this government, that share's been restored. So if you add then together the Pacific and Southeast Asia, we got 2/3 going to the Pacific, and then very nominal amounts now going not only to Africa and the Middle East, which is the yellow, but even to further afield Asia, Southwest and other Asia. So yeah, we're definitely focusing on our neighbors. You can argue, you know, whether we've taken that too far. Whether we're focusing on the issues that matter to them, I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer. And I think it goes to another question I saw from Dave Shearer. So perhaps I'll try to answer that question. And I think he was asking whether this cut on health reflected our comparative advantage. So yeah, I guess to link those two questions, if we look at this reduction in health, is this because our partners have told us, well, look, we're not that interested in health. We've moved on from COVID. You know, please move out of health. I don't think so. I think it's because although we say we're listening to the neighbors, in fact, you know, we have this idea that governance is really important. And that's got to be the flagship of the aid program. And so that's, you know, got to be at least 20%. And then we see this big increase in infrastructure. And that may be coming from donors, but I think from partners, but I think that is competition with China. I mean, if we're going to go into Fiji and tell them that we're going to use our aid to help them expand their port, well, I think that's because we don't want China to do it. And that is going to mean less funding for health. But why health itself is so volatile? When you say education's been cut a bit. Perhaps it's because of scholarships. As scholarships are, you know, everyone likes that, and there's an expectation they'll continue. So that protects education. I think humanitarian, you know, there's just so much humanitarian pressure. Well, so much pressure for humanitarian spending. There's just no way you can cut humanitarian. Of course, it's, you know, the humanitarian budget is long overdue for a major increase. And so with these other sectors sort of not so amenable to being cut, it does seem that sort of health has become the swing sector, and it's the one that goes up in a crisis, but otherwise gets cut to make room for other priorities. Back to you, Amita.
Thanks, Stephen. And I'll get you to stop sharing your screen. We might take another question. We have had a few questions about the decline in health spending, but I think that you've made some comments there. So we might go next to Bridie Rice's question. Wondering if any of you noticed there was a zero mention of ODA in the Foreign Minister's press release, and do you want to comment on how this government is regarding development cooperation more broadly? The big picture looks a little underwhelming from where I sit, though it's hard to tell given the breadth of development-related activity going on, the Pacific visas and labour mobility. Cameron, did you want to have a go at that one first? And then maybe we'll get a comment from Stephen on the labour mobility.
Sure. Thanks, Amita. Thanks, Bridie, for the question. Yeah, it was, I guess, fairly striking that Foreign Minister Penny Wong's press release didn't mention development very much at all. And I guess that stands, I guess, in contrast to, you know, some of the work around statecraft, development, diplomacy, defence. But we do see that huge and growing disparity between, I guess, one arm of statecraft, defence, and the others. I mean, there is a lot of, I guess, non-ODA development work that gets referred to in some of these documents. The caution I would put over that is that often, you know, some of that work is couched as not for publication. So it's very hard to know in some cases what it's for, particularly some of this new kind of blended finance work that we're doing through Export Finance Australia. And it's even harder, I guess, to talk about what impact it's having on development, because it's not necessarily subjected to, you know, some of the rigors that our ODA spending is subject to. So, you know, yes, the government may say we're doing a lot of non-ODA development work, but I would argue, I guess, the transparency of some of that work and what it's actually achieving in terms of its impact leaves a bit to be desired. Thanks.
Stephen, did you want to make some comments on some of those broader initiatives?
Well, if I could just go back to the slides again, Amita, on the
Sure.
on the principle that for every question there's a slide. And if you can see this one, yeah, this is the sort of overall ODA. And yeah, when you look at this and then you look at the next slide, yeah, you wonder, where is this rebuilding? It doesn't look like rebuilding. The best you can say is stabilization. But in fact, the coalition had stabilized aid, after their big cuts. It was stable, actually. I mean, I think it's probably true. Aid is slightly higher under Labor than if the coalition had stayed in power. And there is that slight increase this year relative to what was projected in the forward estimates. I think it's a 4% increase. And if you think why that is, maybe it's partly this terms of trade boom. There was a lot more money than we thought. We're actually in a surplus, or we were in a surplus. We're not going to be in a surplus this year, but yeah, terms of trade are good. And then, but I think the real reason was, there were these things came up during the year. The Tuvalu-Australia treaty came up. That needs a lot of money. These ASEAN announcements and the agreement with Indonesia, the port for Fiji. And, how are you going to fund those? Well, either you've got to cut existing programs, or you are going to have to find a little bit more money for foreign aid. So I think at the moment, the sort of best case scenario is that although the forward estimates and beyond are flat, in fact, every year there will be these diplomatic imperatives, and we will see a gradual increase in real terms. I think that's the best case scenario for foreign aid. But it's, under that scenario, it is going to be very much for imperatives in our region. It's going to have a strong focus on infrastructure, and it's certainly not going to be kind of a response to global humanitarian crises. And yeah, I just think, unfortunately, the media has gone completely silent on foreign aid. There's no longer, more broadly, any expectation that aid will be increased, or any disappointment that it won't. As I said, the only outlet that sort of covers the aid budget now is Pacific Beat, and for them it's, aid to the Pacific is increasing again. Isn't that good? So it's an unfortunate situation, I think.
Thanks, Stephen. We might take a few questions on the aid effectiveness portion of the presentation today. And we've got two questions. So for Stephen, perhaps from David Green, what practical measures do you think would make a difference to the credibility of DFAT's annual investment report, monitoring report scores? And also from Imogen Nichols, is there any further information on the weak M&E practices as the dominant reason for disconnect in aid satisfactory rates?
Okay, thanks, Amita. Well, back to the slides. On the first one, like, what should they do to improve reporting on performance? I mean, I think it was a mistake. I think they got it right in 2020 when DFAT said we're just going to focus on these completed investments, because these are subject to external scrutiny. I mean, I don't mean external like the audit office, anything outside of DFAT. I just mean external, the actual people managing the aid program. And of course, if you ask people, people who are managing the aid program, if you ask me about how my aid projects are going, I'm going to tell you they're going well. So this is definitely a lot more credible. And I think it's unfortunate that DFAT has gone back to saying that, okay, well, it's good they're still reporting the completed investments, but they're giving equal weight. In fact, first of all, they're reporting all the investments, right, including the self-rated ones. So yeah, given they've just announced that, I don't see them moving away from it. But I think our focus should be on these completed ones. And, there should be pressure on DFAT, not just to say, well, look, this disconnect doesn't matter, but this disconnect is a problem. And it shows that we're too optimistic. Our managers are too optimistic when they're thinking about their own aid programs, and that they need a greater dose of realism. And then on, these are the, a positive thing that DFAT has done is to actually list all the programs that were rated unsatisfactory. And to be rated unsatisfactory, you've got to be either unsatisfactory on effectiveness or unsatisfactory on efficiency. It lists them all, and it gives a reason why these projects are regarded as unsatisfactory. And that's really a big improvement from before, where you had some really flagship programs that suddenly are being rated unsatisfactory, and it raised a lot of questions. But yeah, when you look at the reasons, the biggest reason is this M&E, and I think that's just something that it's a bit hard to fathom, because of all the things that you can control in an aid program, your M&E system is probably the one you can control the most. So this is almost entirely within department's control, or within the control of the implementing agency, and is a problem that that clearly needs to be addressed. And it just shouldn't be the reason why a program is regarded as unsatisfactory. It should be regarded as unsatisfactory because it didn't achieve its outcomes, not because we couldn't measure those outcomes. I mean, we have to be realistic. There are a lot of things that are very difficult to measure. If you've got a global extractives, transparency and governance program, you're probably only going to have a vague idea of whether it worked or not. So we need to be realistic, but clearly we need to go beyond saying, well, look, the M&E system's just not good enough. Therefore, this program's unsatisfactory.
Thanks, Stephen. We might turn now to humanitarian funding. Charlotte Smith asked, since humanitarian funding has seen little change and military spending increasing significantly, is it likely to have implications for humanitarian civil military response in humanitarian settings in terms of humanitarian versus military response? Cameron, if you'd like to address that one.
Thanks, Amita, and thanks, Charlotte, for the question. Look, that's probably a little bit out of my field of expertise. I mean, I guess I would note that I think there was in the defence portfolio one measure related to humanitarian assistance in last night's budget, which was, I think, a small amount for this financial year for the airdrops of aid. I think Australia was involved over Gaza. And so, I guess that was the only new funding for humanitarian that was in the budget that we could see. So, I mean, I think obviously in the Pacific, you do see the ADF playing, a bigger role in response. And, I guess some of that's related to showing a more visible presence in the Pacific. But I guess, it's hard to say. I mean, the bulk, obviously the vast bulk of that defence funding is for, equipment with military applications, not humanitarian applications like submarines and the like.
Okay, we've got just a few more minutes to take a couple more questions. We might turn to the ASEAN infrastructure funding. Stephen or Cameron, would you like to look at Chris Cather-Revel's question, which is, are the ASEAN infrastructure funding, is the ASEAN infrastructure funding included in ODA and the projections, particularly given that the funding is right across the Southeast Asia region over 10 years?
Thanks, Amita. Yeah, I think, Chris, thanks for the question. I think some of it is. Not quite sure of the exact proportions. Some of it, with the $2 billion for EFA is not ODA eligible. Those initiatives that are delivered through that $2 billion fund for EFA will be done on a commercial basis. So none of that, as far as we know, is included in ODA. And then, there was a small amount of additional funding in last night's budget for DFAT, continuing work on infrastructure in Southeast Asia. And that, from memory, that funding is to help continue the Partnerships for Infrastructure initiative, which has been going for a while, and I think is going into a second phase. But it wasn't, the dollars weren't massive in terms of new funding, but that's a big program which is already being funded, and that program will continue. But certainly in terms of the Export Finance Australia work, that's not being counted against the aid budget because it's commercial. Thanks.
Thanks, Cameron. And I should just acknowledge that Terence Wood has been helping us out in the chat and answering many of the audience's questions. And I would just point out that Terence Wood has written a recent blog on gender aid. So I'd point everyone to have a look at that on devpolicy.org. We're just hitting the 10 a.m. mark now. So I was wondering, Stephen, if you'd like to end with a question from Lauren. Just bringing up her whole question here. Lauren asks, see it. Where do you expect the criticism of the government's flatlining to come from rather than rebuilding? Do you expect the criticism to come from particular groups, example, in Australia, partner countries, or other donors? Stephen, if you can just take yourself off mute, and we'll hear your last comment.
Yeah, there will be some criticism. I saw ACFID put out a press release that was fairly critical of the aid program. And Mike is running a campaign, so there is some domestic criticism, but overall, I think the aid has fallen away as an issue. So perhaps second term, if Labor's returned, it might become more ambitious. But overall, don't see a huge pressure domestically, nor from partner countries. Other donors, I think Cam's pointed to, the pressure will come up with these replenishments, and would certainly be under pressure from IDA and the World Bank, and from the US to contribute to that. But that pressure also is not something we take so seriously. If you look at our ODA ranking, that Sharon and Cameron have been talking about, we're right down the bottom. It looks terrible, right? But doesn't seem to really generate any kind of domestic reaction. It's something we're sort of quite satisfied with. So I think I wouldn't, given these various factors, as much as we might want and continue to campaign for further aid, I wouldn't expect a great deal more aid in the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Stephen. And with that, that brings us to the close of our annual aid budget breakfast. I'd like to thank our three speakers, Stephen Howes, Cameron Hill, and Sharon Liu. And the research presented today is supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we'd particularly like to also acknowledge the support of our whole Development Policy Centre team. We've had Aloha, we've had Terence Wood online, and we've also had Robin Davies helping us out over the last day or so. Again, if your colleagues have missed this event, we have a Dev Policy blog out this morning. We'll post the link to these presentation slides and the YouTube video of this event later today. And please subscribe to our podcast, Dev Policy Talks, to hear our budget episode later this week. I am just about to put up all of these links in an end slide, so don't worry. If you didn't, I hope you enjoyed joining us this morning, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks.